There's nothing quite like watching your life crumble while trying to stay strong for your child. Mark Thompson had lost his wife, his savings, and nearly his hope, but he still had his 6-year-old daughter Emma, and that was enough to keep him going. When the divorce court awarded him a run-down mansion that nobody else wanted, Mark saw it as just another burden. The old Victorian house had been empty for decades, with broken windows and weeds growing through the porch boards. He figured he'd clean it up and maybe sell it for enough to start over somewhere else. But while clearing junk from the basement, his crowbar hit something unexpected, a hidden panel in the wall. Behind it was a secret vault filled with old documents and journals. As Mark read through the faded pages, he realized the previous owner had left behind clues to a hidden fortune worth $200 million. What secrets was this old house hiding? And who else knew about the treasure buried within its walls? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mark Thompson had never imagined his life would lead him to standing in the overgrown driveway of a Victorian mansion at 7 in the morning, watching his daughter Emma chase fireflies that had lingered too long in the dawn light. The house loomed before them like something from a Gothic novel, its 3 stories of weathered brick and peeling paint, telling the story of decades of neglect. Broken shutters hung at odd angles, and ivy had claimed most of the eastern wall, threading through cracked mortar and pulling pieces of the facade away from the foundation. "Daddy, why does our new house look so sad?" Emma asked, her small hand slipping into his as she gazed up at the towering structure. Her blonde curls caught the morning sun, and Mark felt that familiar tug in his chest, the overwhelming love mixed with fear that came with being solely responsible for another human being's happiness. "Sometimes old houses just need someone to love them back to life," he said, squeezing her hand gently. "Like when you're sick and need soup and hugs to feel better." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense in her 6-year-old understanding of the world. Mark wished he could view their situation with such simple optimism. The truth was, he had no idea how he was going to make this work. His construction job had ended 6 months ago when the housing market took another downturn, and what little savings he'd managed to keep after the divorce was dwindling fast. Sarah's lawyer had been ruthless, taking half of everything and saddling him with child support payments that seemed designed to ensure he'd never get back on his feet. The mansion, officially called Blackwood Manor, according to the deed, had been part of Sarah's family for generations, though no one had lived in it since the 1980s. During the divorce proceedings, Sarah had been only too happy to let Mark have it. "You want to play house?" she'd said with that bitter smile he'd come to know so well. "Fine, take the money pit. See how long your romantic notions last when the roof caves in." But standing here now, Mark could see beyond the decay to the bones of something magnificent. The architecture was solid Victorian, with bay windows and ornate cornices that spoke of a time when craftsmanship meant something. The wraparound porch, though sagging in places, still held the promise of summer evenings and childhood memories. Emma would have space to run and play, something their cramped apartment had never offered. "Can we go inside now?" Emma asked, bouncing on her toes with the excitement the children brought to new adventures. Mark pulled the heavy brass key from his pocket, a key that looked almost too ornate for practical use, and approached the front door. The wood was solid oak, though the varnish had long since faded and peeled. As he turned the key in the lock, he half expected it not to work, but the mechanism turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting patiently all these years for someone to come home. The door swung open with a groan that echoed through the empty halls beyond. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through grimy windows, and the air held that particular smell of old houses, musty and closed, but not unpleasant. It smelled like memories and stories, waiting to be told. Emma stepped inside first, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. "It's like a castle, Daddy." The foyer was impressive even in its neglected state. A grand staircase curved upward to the second floor, its banister carved with intricate details that would have cost a fortune to reproduce today. To the left, Mark could see what had once been a formal parlour, complete with a marble fireplace and built-in bookshelves that still held a few forgotten volumes. To the right was a dining room with a chandelier that hung dark and dusty, its crystal teardrops catching what light filtered through the windows. "The electricity's been turned off for years," Mark explained as Emma reached for a light switch. "We'll need to have it all inspected and probably rewired before we can live here properly." They spent the morning exploring room by room. The kitchen was a mix of 1920s charm and 1970s renovation attempts, with cabinet doors hanging askew and a refrigerator that looked like it belonged in a museum. The pantry was larger than their old apartment's bedroom, with shelves that reached the ceiling and windows that looked out onto what had once been a carefully tended garden. Upstairs, they found 5 bedrooms, each with its own character and story. The master bedroom faced east, with windows that would catch the morning sun. Emma immediately claimed a smaller room that overlooked the backyard, drawn by the window seat and the way the afternoon light painted rainbow patterns on the walls through a stained glass panel. It was in the master bedroom that Mark found the first artifact, a Victorian pocket watch, sitting in the bottom drawer of an ornate dresser that had been left behind. The watch was beautiful, its case engraved with an intricate pattern of vines and flowers, and the initials VB carved in elegant script. When Mark opened it, he found not only the expected timepiece, but a small hidden compartment behind the face. Inside was a tiny rolled piece of paper, so small he almost missed it. "What's that, Daddy?" Emma peered over his shoulder as he carefully unrolled the paper. It appeared to be a hand-drawn map, though of what, Mark couldn't say. There were small symbols and what looked like measurements, but the whole thing was no bigger than a postage stamp and drawn in faded ink. He tucked it carefully back into the watch and slipped the timepiece into his pocket, probably just some old family heirloom left behind by mistake. By late afternoon, they had explored every room except the basement. Mark had been putting it off, partly because basement electrical systems in old houses could be dangerous, and partly because something about the heavy wooden door at the back of the kitchen made him uneasy. But Emma's curiosity was infectious, and he found himself turning the old iron key that hung from a hook beside the door. The basement was larger than he'd expected, running under most of the house's footprint. Stone walls and a dirt floor spoke to the building's age, and the smell of earth and old wood filled his nostrils. A few bare bulbs hung from the ceiling joists, but without power, Mark had to rely on the flashlight app on his phone to navigate. "It's spooky down here," Emma whispered, pressing close to his side. "Just old," Mark assured her, though he had to admit the basement had an atmosphere that made him want to finish their exploration quickly. "Let's see what we're working with and then head back upstairs." The basement was largely empty, except for an old coal furnace that hadn't been used in decades, and some shelving units that held the detritus of previous decades, paint cans, garden tools, and boxes of Christmas decorations that someone had never come back for. It was while examining the electrical panel that Mark's flashlight beam caught something odd. One section of the stone wall looked different from the rest. The mortar was a slightly different color, and the stones were arranged in a subtly different pattern. When he pressed against it, he could swear he felt the slightest give, as if there was space behind the wall. "What is it, Daddy?" Mark ran his hands along the questionable section of wall, feeling for any kind of mechanism or loose stones. Near the floor, his fingers found a small lever, so cleverly disguised as a natural imperfection in the stone that he almost missed it. When he pressed it, he heard a soft click, and a section of the wall swung inward like a door. Behind it was a small chamber, perhaps 4 feet by 6 feet, lined with wooden shelves, and on those shelves were boxes, folders, and what appeared to be several leather-bound journals. Even in the dim light of his phone, Mark could see that someone had taken great care to preserve whatever was stored here. "Daddy, is this like a secret room?" Emma's eyes were wide with excitement. Mark's heart was beating faster than it should have been. This wasn't just a random storage space. This was a deliberate hiding place, carefully concealed and preserved. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to keep whatever was in here safe and secret. "I think it might be, sweetheart," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think it might be exactly that." As evening approached and the temperature began to drop, Mark reluctantly closed the hidden chamber and herded Emma upstairs. They had brought sleeping bags and camping supplies, planning to spend their first night in the house, despite the lack of power or heat. Emma seemed to find the whole adventure exciting, chattering about secret rooms and treasure maps as Mark made peanut butter sandwiches by flashlight in the old kitchen. But as he tucked her into her sleeping bag in what would become her bedroom, Mark's mind kept returning to the hidden chamber. The Victorian pocket watch seemed to pulse in his pocket like a second heartbeat, and he found himself wondering about the man whose initials were carved into its case. V.B. Vincent Blackwood, perhaps the original owner of the house? After Emma had fallen asleep, Mark sat by the window in the master bedroom, looking out over the moonlit grounds and thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been married, employed, and living in a tidy suburban house with a mortgage and a 5-year plan. Now, he was a single father, camping in a Victorian mansion with a mysterious hidden room in the basement. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his palm as he examined it more closely by flashlight. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. This wasn't some mass-produced timepiece, but something created by a master craftsman. The engravings were so detailed that Mark needed his flashlight to make out all the tiny flourishes and symbols worked into the design. The little map in the hidden compartment was even more intriguing in the quiet darkness. By the light of his phone, Mark could make out what appeared to be architectural symbols, stairs, doorways, possibly even the outline of the house itself. There were numbers that might be measurements and small X marks in several locations. It looked like someone had been mapping the house in great detail. Outside, the old mansion settled into the night, with creaks and sighs that spoke of age and weight and stories untold. Mark had renovated enough old houses to know that these sounds were normal, just the building's materials expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. But tonight, in this place, with the mysterious chamber fresh in his mind and the ornate pocket watch in his hand, every sound seemed to carry meaning. As he finally prepared for sleep, Mark made a mental list of everything he needed to do. Get the power turned on, have the plumbing inspected, check the roof for leaks, and eventually tackle the hidden chamber in the basement. He'd need to be systematic about it, careful. Whatever secrets the previous owner had left behind, they deserved to be treated with respect. Emma stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about castles and princesses, and Mark felt that familiar surge of protective love. Whatever mysteries this old house held, his first priority would always be creating a safe, stable home for his daughter. Everything else was just curiosity. But as he drifted off to sleep in the grand master bedroom of Blackwood Manor, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The pocket watch ticked steadily from the nightstand, marking time in a house where time seemed to have stopped decades ago, waiting for someone to wind it back to life. 3 days later, Mark stood in the hardware store checkout line with a cart full of electrical supplies, his phone pressed to his ear as he argued with the power company about reconnection fees. Emma sat in the cart's child seat, swinging her legs and humming to herself as she colored in a princess coloring book. "Yes, I understand there's a deposit required, but $800 seems excessive for a residential reconnection," Mark said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. The clerk behind the counter gave him a sympathetic look. Apparently this wasn't an uncommon conversation in a town where many old properties sat vacant for years at a time. The power company representative was unmoved. "Sir, the property has been without service for over 15 years. We'll need to inspect the entire electrical system before reconnection, and given the age of the structure, we're required to treat it as a new installation for insurance purposes." Mark closed his eyes and did quick math in his head. 800 for the deposit, another 1,000 for the inspection, and probably several thousand more for any upgrades they'd require. His checking account balance flashed before his eyes like a warning light. "Can I call you back?" he asked, ending the call before waiting for an answer. "Problems, Daddy?" Emma looked up from her coloring book with that peculiar intuition children had for sensing adult stress. "Nothing we can't figure out, sweetheart," Mark said, forcing a smile. "How about we head home and I'll make us some lunch?" Home. It surprised him how naturally the word had come. In just 3 days, the old mansion had begun to feel like more than just a temporary solution. Maybe it was Emma's excitement about having her own room, or maybe it was his own growing appreciation for the solid craftsmanship and potential he saw in every corner of the building. Either way, Blackwood Manor was starting to feel less like a burden and more like a possibility. Back at the house, Mark made sandwiches while Emma played in the backyard, her laughter drifting through the open windows. They'd been getting by with camping gear and battery-powered lanterns, but Mark knew that wasn't sustainable long-term. Emma would need to start school in a few weeks, and that meant they needed proper electricity, heat, and running water. After lunch, while Emma napped in her sleeping bag upstairs, Mark decided to tackle the basement electrical panel. He'd been putting off a detailed inspection, partly because of the power situation, and partly because he kept getting distracted by the hidden chamber. But if he was going to convince the power company to reconnect service at a reasonable cost, he needed to understand exactly what he was working with. Armed with a flashlight and his electrical tester, Mark made his way down to the basement. The old stone walls felt cool against the afternoon heat, and dust motes danced in the beam of his flashlight as he examined the electrical panel. What he found was both better and worse than he'd expected. The wiring was old, but appeared to have been well maintained, with several upgrades that looked like they'd been done by someone who knew what they were doing. However, there were also several mysterious additions, extra circuits that didn't seem to correspond to any obvious electrical needs. It was while tracing one of these mysterious circuits that Mark found himself back at the hidden chamber. The wire seemed to disappear into the wall right next to the concealed door. Without really planning to, Mark found himself pressing the hidden lever again, watching the stone panel swing inward to reveal the carefully preserved storage space. In daylight, or rather, in the steady beam of his flashlight, the contents of the chamber were even more intriguing. The leather-bound journals were stacked neatly on one shelf, their spines labeled with dates ranging from 1920 to 1934. Below them were boxes of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be business records. Everything was organized with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that spoke of someone who expected these materials to be important for a very long time. Mark selected the journal marked 1922 and opened it carefully. The pages were yellow with age but still legible, filled with neat handwriting in dark blue ink. The first entry was dated January 15th, 1920. The amendment is now in effect, and while the politicians congratulate themselves on legislating morality, those of us with business sense understand what this really means. Prohibition will create opportunities for men willing to take certain risks. I have been approached by associates from Chicago regarding arrangements that could prove quite profitable. Mark's pulse quickened as he read further. The journal entries painted a picture of Vincent Blackwood as a man who had seen prohibition not as a moral crusade, but as a business opportunity. Entry after entry detailed meetings, arrangements, and what could only be described as Bootlegging operations. The tunnel system beneath the house proves invaluable for storage and transport. What the founding fathers built to connect to the river for legitimate commerce now serves our more delicate transactions. The authorities suspect nothing. Who would imagine that a respected businessman would involve himself in such enterprises? Tunnels beneath the house? Mark looked around the basement with new eyes. He'd assumed it was just a standard cellar, but if Vincent's journal was accurate, there were hidden passages somewhere down here. Tommy Torino visited today with his Chicago associates. They are impressed with our operation and have proposed expanding our territory. The money is substantial, but I cannot shake the feeling that these men are more dangerous than they initially appeared. Still, the profits from our arrangement have allowed me to expand the legitimate businesses, and the community continues to benefit from our charitable contributions. Mark flipped through more pages, his fascination growing with each entry. Vincent Blackwood emerged as a complex figure, a man involved in illegal activities during Prohibition, but also someone who seemed genuinely concerned with his community and careful about his business relationships. The entries from 1923 took a darker turn. The Chicago men grow more demanding. What began as a mutually profitable arrangement has become something approaching extortion. They speak of insurance and protection, but their meaning is clear. I have begun taking precautions, including the establishment of certain safeguards should our relationship deteriorate further. Today, I completed the installation of what I hope will never be necessary insurance policies of a different sort. Should anything happen to me, should the Chicago Association decide that I am more valuable as an example than as a partner, I have made arrangements to ensure my legacy and the security of those I care about. Mark's hands were trembling slightly as he read. This wasn't just a family journal, it was evidence of involvement with organized crime during one of America's most violent periods. But it was the entries from 1924 that made his blood run cold. They came to the house last night, not to the front door like civilized men, but through the tunnels, thinking to surprise me. They underestimated both my preparation and my resolve. I am no longer the naive businessman who first shook hands with Tommy Torino. The arrangements I have made will ensure that my family's future is secure, regardless of what these men may do to me. I've decided to disappear, not permanently, but long enough for the Chicago situation to resolve itself through other means. The local authorities have been made aware of certain activities, though they do not yet know the full scope of what has transpired here. I leave this record not as confession, but as insurance should anyone attempt to claim what is mine by right. They will find that Vincent Blackwood was not a man to be underestimated. The final entries were the most cryptic. The main cache remains secure, its location known only to myself and recorded in the manner we discussed. The smaller reserves have been distributed according to the plan. Should I not return, the worthy heir will find their way to the truth through the breadcrumbs I have left. The pocket watch will guide them to the map to the records, and the records to justice. Mark's hand went instinctively to his pocket, where the Victorian watch had become a constant companion over the past few days. Vincent had planned this somehow. Across nearly a century, he had planned for someone to find these journals, to piece together his story. But the most shocking revelation came in the very last entry, dated December 15th, 1934. The reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, though necessarily so. Vincent Blackwood died in that automobile accident, but the man who writes these words has work yet to do. The Chicago problem has been solved through channels that will not bear scrutiny, but justice has been served. I now begin the next phase of my life, under circumstances that will allow me to continue the work that matters, building something lasting for future generations. To whoever finds these records, know this: the fortune you seek is real, but it comes with responsibility. I have spent my life learning that true wealth is not what a man accumulates for himself, but what he creates for others. Choose wisely. Mark closed the journal with hands that were definitely shaking now. Vincent Blackwood had faked his own death. The man whose house Mark now owned, whose pocket watch he carried, whose secrets he was slowly uncovering, had staged his disappearance and lived under a new identity for decades afterward. The sound of footsteps on the kitchen floor above reminded Mark that Emma was awake from her nap. He carefully returned the journal to its place and closed the hidden chamber, his mind reeling with questions. If Vincent had faked his death, what had happened to him? Where was this main cache he'd written about? And what did he mean by the worthy heir? As Mark climbed the basement stairs, he tried to process what he'd learned. The man who had built this house, who had carved his initials into that pocket watch, had been involved in bootlegging, had tangled with Chicago organized crime, and had somehow managed to fake his own death to escape the consequences. It sounded like something out of a movie, not the quiet family history of a Victorian mansion in a small town. "Daddy, can we explore the garden today?" Emma met him at the top of the stairs, her blonde hair still mussed from sleep. "Sure, sweetheart," Mark said, grateful for the normalcy of his daughter's request. "Let me just put these tools away first." But as they walked through the overgrown garden that afternoon, Emma chattering about which flowers they should plant and where they might put a swing, Mark found his attention divided. Every shadow seemed to hold secrets. Every overgrown path seemed to hint at hidden purposes. According to Vincent's journal, there were tunnels somewhere beneath the house, connecting to the river. There were hidden caches and mysterious arrangements that had kept a fortune safe for nearly a century. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Mark sat on the front porch steps with Vincent's pocket watch in his hands, trying to make sense of everything he'd learned. The watch ticked steadily, marking time that stretched back to an era of speakeasies and gangsters, of men who built empires in shadows and disappeared when the shadows grew too deep. The tiny map hidden in the watch's secret compartment seemed more significant now. If Vincent had left breadcrumbs for a worthy heir to follow, then that map was probably the first clue in a puzzle that had waited nearly 90 years for someone to solve it. Mark had always been good at puzzles, at seeing how pieces fit together. It was part of what had made him a skilled construction worker, the ability to understand how a structure was meant to work, how all the components supported each other. Now he found himself facing a different kind of construction project, rebuilding not just a house, but understanding the life of the man who had built it. As the night deepened around Blackwood Manor, Mark made a decision that would change everything. He was going to solve Vincent Blackwood's puzzle, not just out of curiosity, but because something in those journal entries had resonated with him. Vincent had been a man trying to provide for his family and his community, even when that meant making difficult choices. Mark understood that kind of desperation, that willingness to take risks when everything you cared about was on the line. The pocket watch continued its steady rhythm as Mark finally went inside, its ticking a reminder that some stories waited decades to find their proper ending. Tomorrow, he would begin following the breadcrumbs Vincent Blackwood had left behind, starting with the tiny map that might hold the key to understanding how a Victorian mansion in a small town had become the center of a mystery worth $200 million. Mark woke before dawn the next morning, his mind already racing with questions about Vincent's journal. The pocket watch on his nightstand showed 5:47 a.m., and pale grey light was just beginning to filter through the master bedroom's tall windows. Emma wouldn't wake for another hour at least, which gave him time to examine the tiny map more carefully. In the growing daylight, the map proved even more intriguing than it had appeared by flashlight. Using a magnifying glass he'd found in one of the kitchen drawers, Mark could make out architectural details that definitely corresponded to the mansion's layout. There was the main house, the wraparound porch, and what appeared to be outbuildings that no longer existed. But it was the symbols scattered throughout the drawing that captured his attention. Small circles marked various locations throughout the house, each accompanied by a letter or number. Some were inside the main structure, others appeared to be in the basement area, and a few were positioned in what looked like the garden or grounds. At the bottom of the map, in handwriting so small it was barely visible, were the words, "Truth builds upon truth, secrets upon secrets." Mark had spent enough time studying architectural plans to recognize that this wasn't just a map, it was a guide. Vincent Blackwood had left specific markers, and Mark was beginning to understand that the pocket watch was just the first piece of a much larger puzzle. After breakfast, while Emma played with her dolls in the morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, Mark decided to test his theory about the map. The first symbol, a circle with the letter A inside it, appeared to be located in what Vincent's drawing showed as the library. Mark remembered seeing built-in bookshelves in what he'd assumed was just a formal parlor, and the location seemed to match. "Emma, how would you like to help Daddy with a treasure hunt?" Mark asked, folding the map carefully and slipping it into his shirt pocket. His daughter's eyes lit up with excitement. A real treasure hunt, like pirates. "Something like that," Mark said, smiling at her enthusiasm. "We're going to look for clues that the man who used to live here left behind." They made their way to the parlor, Emma skipping beside him and chattering about treasure chests and gold coins. The room looked different in the morning light, less gloomy and more dignified. The built-in bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, interrupted only by the marble fireplace and two tall windows that faced the front garden. According to the map, the A symbol was positioned near the fireplace. Mark began examining the area systematically, running his hands along the mantelpiece and checking behind the few books that remained on the shelves. Emma helped by spinning around in the center of the room and announcing her discoveries. "Daddy, there's a spider web up there. And this book smells funny." It was Emma who actually found it, though she didn't realize the significance at the time. While Mark was examining the fireplace damper, she had climbed onto a chair to reach a leather-bound volume on one of the higher shelves. "Daddy, this book feels weird," she announced, struggling to pull it free from its position. Mark looked over to find her tugging at what appeared to be a standard book spine, but as she pulled, the entire section of shelf swung outward slightly. It wasn't a book at all, it was a lever, disguised to look like part of the library. "Emma, that's brilliant," Mark said, lifting her down from the chair and examining her discovery. When he pulled the fake book spine fully, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a narrow compartment behind the wall. Inside the hidden space were more documents, but these were different from the journals in the basement. These appeared to be business correspondence, and as Mark examined them, he realized he was looking at coded letters between Vincent and various associates. The codes were simple substitution ciphers, but they were consistent and clearly part of an organized system. One letter, dated March 1923, particularly caught his attention. "The Chicago arrangements continue as planned. Our mutual friend has proved reliable, though his associates grow more demanding. I have begun implementing our discussed insurance policies. The primary reserve remains secure, but I advise expanding our secondary positions as discussed. The local situation remains stable, though I believe we should accelerate our timeline." Another letter, from someone signed only as TT, probably Tommy Torino from the journal entries, was more direct. "Vincent, the boys in Chicago are asking questions about your operation. Word is, you're holding back on them, keeping more than your agreed percentage. That's not smart business, friend. I'd hate to see this arrangement go south over a misunderstanding about numbers." Vincent's response was equally clear. "My arrangements with your Chicago associates are exactly as agreed. If they have concerns about my business practices, they are welcome to examine my books. However, I should mention that my books reflect only the transactions related to our mutual enterprises. My other business interests remain, naturally, private matters." Mark was beginning to understand Vincent's situation more clearly. The man had been walking a tightrope between legitimate business and criminal enterprise, trying to maintain independence while working with increasingly dangerous partners. The letters showed a progression from cooperation to tension to what looked like barely concealed threats. But it was the last document in the hidden compartment that made Mark's heart skip a beat. It was a safety deposit box key attached to a small card with an address downtown and a box number, 247. "What's that, Daddy?" Emma asked, pointing to the key. "I think it's another clue, sweetheart," Mark said, his mind already racing ahead. Vincent hadn't just hidden documents in the house, he'd created an entire network of hiding places throughout the town. The rest of the morning was spent exploring other locations marked on the map. The B symbol led them to the dining room, where Mark discovered that one of the chair rail moldings was actually a sliding panel that concealed a narrow space containing more coded correspondence. The C symbol, located in what Vincent's map showed as a study, revealed a hidden drawer in an antique desk that had been left behind, containing what appeared to be business ledgers written in the same code as the letters. With each discovery, Mark felt like he was getting to know Vincent Blackwood as a person. The man had been methodical, careful, and clearly planning for contingencies that he hoped would never be necessary. But he had also been someone who took pride in craftsmanship. Each hiding place was cleverly designed and beautifully executed, hidden in plain sight, but accessible to someone who knew what to look for. It was while they were exploring the study that Mark noticed something troubling. Some of the furniture had been moved recently, not recently enough to be from his and Emma's arrival, but within the last few years. Dust patterns on the floor showed where pieces had been shifted, and one of the window latches showed signs of having been opened from the outside. Someone else had been in this house, and they had been searching for something. That afternoon, while Emma napped, Mark called his brother Jake from the front porch steps. Jake was the only family member who had maintained any kind of relationship with Mark after the divorce, and Mark trusted his judgment about complicated situations. "You're telling me you found some kind of treasure map in this old house?" Jake's voice carried skepticism but also concern. "Mark, man, are you sure you're thinking clearly about this? I mean, you've been under a lot of stress lately." "Jake, I'm not making this up," Mark said, keeping his voice low so he wouldn't wake Emma. "I've got journals, coded letters, and a safety deposit box key. This Vincent Blackwood guy was involved in some serious business back in the 20s and 30s. "Okay, let's say you're right," Jake said. "Let's say there really was some kind of bootlegger fortune hidden in your house. What makes you think it's still there? If there was money hidden somewhere, don't you think someone would have found it by now?" It was a reasonable question, and one that Mark had been asking himself. "Maybe they tried," he said, thinking about the moved furniture and the signs of previous searches. But Vincent was smart. He didn't just hide things randomly, he created a system. You'd need to understand the whole puzzle to find the real prize. And you think you can figure out what professional treasure hunters couldn't? Mark was quiet for a moment, watching Emma through the window as she slept peacefully in her sleeping bag. "I think Vincent designed this for someone specific. Someone who would live in the house, someone who would care about it enough to restore it properly. All those other searchers were just looking for quick money. I'm trying to understand the man who built this place." After he hung up, Mark sat for a long time on the porch steps, turning the safety deposit box key over in his hands. Jake's skepticism was probably healthy. Mark knew he was getting caught up in the mystery, maybe losing perspective on the practical realities of his situation. He still needed to get the electricity connected, find work, and figure out how to support Emma long-term. But something in Vincent's journals had spoken to him on a level that went beyond simple curiosity. Vincent Blackwood had been a man trying to build something lasting, trying to provide for his family, while navigating a world that seemed determined to tear down everything he cared about. Mark understood that feeling intimately. As evening approached, Mark made a decision. Tomorrow, he would drive downtown to the bank and see if Vincent's safety deposit box still existed. It was probably a long shot. 90 years was a long time for a bank account to remain active. But the key was real. The address was real, and Mark was beginning to believe that Vincent Blackwood had been the kind of man who planned for very long contingencies indeed. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep, Mark spread Vincent's map on the kitchen table and began making his own notes. He had found 3 of the marked locations so far, and each had contained pieces of a larger puzzle, but the map showed at least a dozen more symbols scattered throughout the house and grounds. If Vincent had really hidden a fortune worth $200 million, he had made sure that finding it would require patience, intelligence, and dedication. Mark was beginning to suspect that those qualities weren't coincidental requirements. Vincent hadn't just been hiding money, he had been selecting the person who would eventually find it. And everything Mark had learned so far suggested that Vincent Blackwood had been a very good judge of character. The pocket watch ticked steadily from its place on the table, keeping time while Mark planned his next moves in a treasure hunt that had been nearly a century in the making. Outside, the old mansion settled into the night with its familiar creaks and sighs, as if it too were waiting to see what secrets tomorrow would reveal. The First National Bank of Millbrook looked exactly like what it was, a solid, conservative institution that had been serving the community since 1892. The limestone facade and brass fixtures spoke of permanence and reliability, qualities that Mark hoped would extend to their record-keeping practices. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, Emma's hand in his, gathering courage for what might be a very awkward conversation. "Is this where we're going to find more treasure?" Emma asked, looking up at the imposing building with curiosity rather than intimidation. "We'll see, sweetheart," Mark said. "Sometimes treasure hunts involve talking to grown-ups in suits." The lobby was cool and quiet, with the particular hush that banks seem to cultivate. Mark approached the information desk, where a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair looked up expectantly. "Good morning," Mark said, pulling the safety deposit box key from his pocket. "I know this is probably unusual, but I found this key in a house I recently inherited, and I'm trying to determine if the corresponding box still exists." The woman, her nameplate read, "Patricia Wells, Customer Service," examined the key with interest. "This is quite old," she said. "May I ask what property you inherited?" "Blackwood Manor, on Elm Street," Mark replied. "The Victorian house that's been empty for years." Patricia's expression shifted to one of recognition and what looked like surprise. "The Blackwood place? My goodness, I haven't heard that name in years. Let me get Mr. Henderson. He's been with the bank for 40 years and would know more about historical accounts." While they waited, Emma amused herself by counting the marble squares on the floor, and Mark tried to calm his nerves. He had no legal right to access Vincent's safety deposit box, assuming it still existed. For all he knew, he was about to have a very embarrassing conversation about attempted theft. Mr. Henderson turned out to be a tall, thin man in his 70s, with silver hair and the measured demeanor of someone who had seen every possible banking scenario at least twice. He examined the key carefully, turning it over in his hands with the reverence of someone who appreciated craftsmanship. "Vincent Blackwood," he murmured. "Now there's a name I haven't heard in decades. My father used to tell stories about him, quite the businessman in his day." "You knew him?" Mark asked, surprised. "Oh no, he was before my time, but the Blackwood account has been a curiosity here for years, automatically maintained through a trust fund that renews itself annually. Box 247, if I'm not mistaken." Mr. Henderson's eyes sharpened as he looked at Mark. "The question is, what's your legal standing regarding Mr. Blackwood's estate?" Mark explained about inheriting the house through his divorce settlement, showing the deed and other documentation he'd brought along. Mr. Henderson examined the papers carefully, occasionally making thoughtful sounds under his breath. "Interesting," he said finally. "The property deed does show clear ownership transfer to you, and there is a provision in Mr. Blackwood's original trust documents that grants the current legal owner of Blackwood Manor access to Box 247. Quite unusual foresight, really." 20 minutes later, Mark found himself in the bank's vault, staring at a safety deposit box that had been waiting patiently for nearly 90 years. Mr. Henderson turned the bank's key while Mark turned Vincent's key, and the box opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through time. Inside were documents that made Mark's discoveries at the house look like rough drafts. These were the finished products of Vincent's meticulous planning, legal documents, business contracts, and maps that were far more detailed than anything Mark had found so far. The first item was a letter addressed simply to the heir, written in Vincent's now familiar handwriting. If you are reading this, you have demonstrated the intelligence and persistence that I hope to find in whoever would ultimately claim my legacy. You have also, by virtue of accessing this box, proven legal ownership of Blackwood Manor, which suggests you are someone who needs what I have to offer rather than someone who simply wants it. The documents in this box will reveal the true scope of my arrangements. What began as necessity during the Prohibition years evolved into something much larger, a network of investments, properties, and assets that have grown considerably over the decades since my supposed death. The fortune you seek is real, but it comes with responsibilities that I trust you will understand as you learn more about my intentions. Mark's hands were trembling as he continued reading. Vincent had faked his death in 1934, but he had lived until 1987, secretly managing his investments and expanding his legitimate business interests. The letter detailed a complex web of holding companies, real estate investments, and what appeared to be a substantial charitable foundation, all managed through intermediaries and structured to continue growing regardless of Vincent's personal involvement. The second document was a property deed for a warehouse on the outskirts of town, apparently purchased in 1923 and continuously maintained since then. According to the accompanying documents, the warehouse had been rented to various legitimate businesses over the years, but a section of the building remained under Vincent's exclusive control. "This is getting complicated," Mark murmured to himself. "What's that, Daddy?" Emma looked up from the children's books that Patricia had kindly brought her while they waited. "Just thinking out loud, sweetheart." The third document was perhaps the most significant, a detailed map of the tunnel system beneath Blackwood Manor, complete with measurements, structural notes, and connections to the town's old storm drain network. Vincent's journal entries about using tunnels for bootlegging operations had been accurate, but this map showed that the system was far more extensive than Mark had imagined. The tunnels didn't just connect to the river, they connected to several other properties throughout the town, including the warehouse whose deed was in the safety deposit box. But it was the final document that stopped Mark's breath entirely. It was a trust fund statement dated just 6 months earlier, showing assets worth $247 million managed by a firm in the state capital. Vincent Blackwood's estate was not only real, it was still growing. According to the trust documents, the entire estate would transfer to whoever could prove legal ownership of Blackwood Manor and demonstrate knowledge of Vincent's complete intentions. The phrase was vague, but Mark was beginning to understand that Vincent's treasure hunt was as much about character testing as it was about puzzle solving. "Mr. Henderson," Mark said, his voice barely steady, "these documents reference a trust fund. Is this something your bank is involved with?" The banker examined the papers Mark showed him, his expression growing increasingly serious. "These are legitimate documents," he said slowly. "The Vincent Blackwood Trust is managed by Harrison Powell, associates in the capital, but they send us annual updates regarding the safety deposit box maintenance. I had no idea the estate was of this magnitude." Mark carefully returned the documents to the box, his mind reeling with the implications. Vincent Haddon Blackwood had not only survived his faked death, but had spent the next 53 years building a fortune that was now worth nearly $250 million. And somehow, Mark Thompson, an unemployed construction worker going through a difficult divorce, had stumbled into the position of potential heir to the entire estate. On the drive home, with Emma chattering in the back seat about their bank adventure, Mark tried to process what he'd learned. The warehouse address was only 15 minutes from Blackwood Manor, and according to the deed, he now had legal access to whatever Vincent had been storing there for the past 90 years. But Mark was also beginning to realize that he wasn't the first person to discover Vincent's secrets. The signs of previous searches at the house, the moved furniture, the subtle indications that someone else had been looking for something. It all suggested that others knew about Vincent's fortune and had been trying to find it for years. The question was, who were they, and what would they do when they realized that Mark was close to solving Vincent's puzzle? That afternoon, while Emma played in the garden, Mark called the law firm mentioned in the trust documents. The conversation was brief, but illuminating. Yes, the Vincent Blackwood Trust existed. Yes, there were provisions for transferring the assets to whoever could meet certain criteria. And yes, they would be very interested in meeting with Mark to discuss his discoveries. "We've been waiting for this call for many years, Mr. Thompson," the lawyer had said. Vincent Blackwood was quite specific about his intentions. "When can you come to the capital?" Mark scheduled an appointment for the following week, after he'd had a chance to explore the warehouse and continue following Vincent's clues. He was beginning to understand that rushing through Vincent's puzzle would be a mistake. The man had designed his treasure hunt to reveal character as much as intelligence, and Mark suspected that patience and thoroughness were qualities Vincent had been looking for in his eventual heir. As evening approached, Mark stood in the mansion's grand foyer, looking up at the curved staircase and ornate ceiling. Vincent Blackwood had built this house as more than just a home. He had created it as the centerpiece of an elaborate test that had been waiting nearly a century for the right person to solve it. Mark was beginning to believe that he might actually be that person. But he was also starting to understand that claiming Vincent's legacy would require more than just solving puzzles. It would mean taking on responsibilities that Vincent had carried for decades, continuing work that had started as criminal necessity but had evolved into something approaching philanthropy. The pocket watch ticked steadily from Mark's palm as he stood in the fading light, counting time while he prepared for the next phase of Vincent Blackwood's treasure hunt. Tomorrow, he would visit the warehouse and see what other secrets Vincent had preserved for his unknown heir. Tonight, he would study the tunnel maps and begin to understand the full scope of the infrastructure Vincent had created to support his hidden empire. Emma's laughter drifted in from the garden, where she was chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk. Whatever Vincent Blackwood's final test required of him, Mark was determined to complete it not just for the fortune it promised, but for the chance to build the kind of stable, secure future that his daughter deserved. The warehouse looked unremarkable from the outside, a standard brick industrial building that could have housed anything from auto parts to furniture storage. Mark stood in the gravel parking lot, Emma's hand in his, studying the structure with the same careful attention he'd learned to apply to Vincent's other secrets. The address matched the deed from the safety deposit box, and the key Vincent had hidden in the house fit the heavy padlock on the side door. "Is this where the treasure is, Daddy?" Emma asked, looking skeptically at the plain building. "Part of it, maybe," Mark said, though he was beginning to understand that Vincent's definition of treasure might be more complicated than gold coins and jewelry. The door opened into a space that had clearly been divided into two sections. The larger area, taking up perhaps 3/4 of the building, showed signs of recent use: clean floors, organized storage racks, and the lingering smell of motor oil that suggested automotive work. But it was the smaller section, separated by a wall that looked much newer than the rest of the building, that drew Mark's attention. A second key from Vincent's collection opened the door to this private area, revealing a space that felt like stepping back in time. Unlike the basement chamber at the house, this room had been designed for long-term occupation. There were electric lights, ventilation, and even a small kitchenette that looked like it dated from the 1950s. But what dominated the space was an enormous collection of photographs, documents, and what appeared to be surveillance materials covering nearly every wall. "Wow," Emma breathed, looking around at the walls covered with pictures. "It's like a giant scrapbook." Mark moved closer to examine the photographs, and what he saw made his understanding of Vincent Blackwood shift dramatically. These weren't just family photos or business records. They were evidence of a decades-long investigation into corruption that stretched far beyond Prohibition-era bootlegging. The earliest photographs, dating from the 1920s, based on the clothing and cars visible, showed Vincent with various men in expensive suits. But unlike casual business meetings, these pictures had the quality of surveillance photos taken from a distance, often catching their subjects unaware. Handwritten notes on the backs identified the men as known criminals, corrupt politicians, and what Vincent described as enemies of legitimate commerce. One series of photographs particularly caught Mark's attention. They showed a man identified as Thomas Torino, Chicago associate, meeting with several local officials, including someone Vincent had labeled as Mayor Hensley, compromised. The photos were dated 1924, and Vincent's notes described payments, changing hands, and what appeared to be the planning of illegal activities. But it was the more recent photographs that truly shocked Mark. The collection continued through the decades, showing the same corruption network evolving and expanding. Photos from the 1940s showed new faces but similar activities. The 1960s brought images of what appeared to be money laundering operations run through legitimate businesses, and photographs from the 1980s, just a few years before Vincent's actual death, showed that the network had grown into something resembling a modern organized crime operation. Vincent wasn't just involved in bootlegging, Mark murmured to himself, as the scope of what he was seeing became clear. He was documenting corruption for decades. Emma had wandered to a corner of the room where Vincent had set up what appeared to be a child's play area, probably for visits from grandchildren or great-grandchildren that Mark was only now learning existed. She was happily examining a collection of old toys, while Mark continued his exploration of Vincent's secret archive. The photographs were organized chronologically and by subject, showing a level of documentation that would have impressed professional investigators. Vincent had not only recorded meetings and transactions, but had somehow obtained documents, recorded conversations, and gathered evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of corruption spanning 6 decades. One wall was dedicated entirely to what Vincent labeled the Henderson Connection. Mark recognized the name. Mr. Henderson from the bank was part of a family that had apparently been involved in the corruption network for generations. The photographs showed multiple generations of Hendersons meeting with known criminals, facilitating money transfers and providing banking services that enabled illegal activities to continue. Mark felt a chill as he realized that his friendly conversation with Mr. Henderson at the bank might not have been as innocent as it had seemed. If Vincent's evidence was accurate, the Henderson family had been helping to launder money and hide assets for organized crime figures for decades. Mark's visit to access Vincent's safety deposit box had probably been reported to people who had been looking for Vincent's secrets for a very long time. Another section of photographs focused on real estate transactions that Vincent labeled land grab operations. The images showed corrupt officials approving development projects, legitimate businesses being forced out through intimidation, and properties being acquired through what appeared to be systematic fraud. Mark recognized several buildings in the town's downtown area, including some that were now owned by the same families whose earlier generations appeared in Vincent's bootlegging photos. But it was the final section of photographs that made Mark understand the true scope of what he had stumbled into. These pictures, dating from the 1970s and 1980s, showed Vincent himself, but not as Mark had imagined him. The man in these photographs was older, grayer, but very much alive, and he was meeting with FBI agents, state investigators, and what appeared to be federal prosecutors. Vincent Blackwood hadn't just been documenting corruption, he had been serving as an informant for law enforcement agencies, helping to build cases against the very criminal network he had once been part of. The photographs showed him turning over documents, providing testimony, and apparently helping to coordinate investigations that had resulted in numerous arrests and convictions throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. A thick folder labeled Current Operations contained the most recent materials, including photographs from the early 1980s that showed some of the same families Vincent had been tracking were still active. The criminal network hadn't disappeared, it had evolved, adapted, and found new ways to operate. And according to Vincent's notes, they were still looking for the evidence he had compiled over decades of careful documentation. "Daddy, look at this," Emma called from her corner, holding up an old wooden toy train. "The man who lived here must have had kids too." "I think you're right, sweetheart," Mark said, though his attention was divided between Emma's discovery and the growing realization of what Vincent's treasure hunt really meant. The fortune Vincent had accumulated wasn't just hidden money. It was evidence that could destroy a corruption network that had been operating for nearly a century. Mark found Vincent's final instructions in a sealed envelope marked "For the Hair." Read only after viewing all evidence. The letter inside was dated 1987, apparently written shortly before Vincent's actual death. "If you have reached this point, you understand that what I have preserved is more than simple wealth. The money is real, and it is yours by right of inheritance and by demonstration of the character necessary to use it wisely. But with this inheritance comes responsibility to continue the work I have spent my life completing. The criminal network I helped create in my youth grew beyond anything I could have imagined. My attempts to extricate myself from their operations led to decades of documenting their activities and working with law enforcement to limit their influence. But they are persistent, adaptable, and patient. They have been looking for my evidence for 40 years, and they will continue looking until someone has the courage to finish what I started. The complete evidence files are hidden in the location indicated by the tunnel maps. The fortune I have accumulated is legitimate and clean, earned through investments and business ventures that had nothing to do with my earlier mistakes. But claiming that fortune will make you a target for people who cannot afford to let Vincent Blackwood's final testimony see the light of day. Choose carefully. The money is yours, regardless of what you decide about the evidence. But if you choose to complete my work, you will be completing justice that has been delayed for decades, and you will be ensuring that future generations do not suffer under the corruption that I helped enable. Mark folded the letter with hands that were definitely shaking now. Vincent hadn't just left him a treasure hunt, he had left him a choice between personal gain and public service that would put both Mark and Emma at risk. As they prepared to leave the warehouse, Emma tugging on his hand and chattering about the toys she'd found, Mark realized that someone was watching them from across the street. A black sedan sat in the parking lot of a closed restaurant, its occupants too distant to identify, but close enough to be clearly observing the warehouse. Mark didn't panic, but he didn't dawdle either. He locked the warehouse carefully and drove home by a circuitous route, checking his mirrors frequently. The black sedan followed them for several blocks before disappearing down a side street, but Mark had gotten the message. Vincent's criminal associates or their descendants were still active, still interested in Vincent's secrets, and now they knew that Mark was close to finding what they had been seeking for decades. That evening, after Emma had fallen asleep, Mark sat on the mansion's front porch with Vincent's tunnel maps spread before him. According to the documents, the main evidence cache was hidden in a section of the tunnel system that connected the mansion's basement to an old storm drain that ran beneath the town's cemetery. Vincent had chosen the location carefully. It was accessible from the mansion, but remote enough that casual searchers would never find it. But Mark was beginning to understand that he wasn't dealing with casual searchers. The people watching him were part of an organization that had been looking for Vincent's evidence for 40 years. They had resources, patience, and a very strong motivation to prevent Vincent's final testimony from ever reaching the authorities. As Mark studied the maps by flashlight, planning his approach to Vincent's final hiding place, he realized that his life had reached a turning point that went far beyond simple financial security. Vincent Blackwood had spent decades gathering evidence against a criminal network that was still operating, still corrupt, still dangerous. And now that evidence, along with a fortune worth nearly $250 million, was about to become Mark Thompson's responsibility. The pocket watch ticked steadily from the porch railing, counting down time toward a decision that would determine not just Mark and Emma's future, but potentially the fate of an entire community that had been living under the shadow of organized corruption for nearly a century. Mark didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the old mansion, every rustle of wind through the trees outside, seemed to carry the possibility of danger. He found himself checking on Emma multiple times, reassured by her peaceful breathing, but increasingly worried about what his pursuit of Vincent's secrets might mean for her safety. By dawn, he had made a decision. Before he ventured into Vincent's tunnel system to find the main evidence cache, he needed to understand exactly what he was dealing with. The photographs at the warehouse had shown him the scope of the corruption Vincent had been documenting, but Mark needed details, names, dates, financial records that would help him assess the current threat level. After breakfast, while Emma played in the garden under his watchful eye, Mark returned to the mansion's hidden chambers with new purpose. He had found journals and correspondence, but Vincent had mentioned business ledgers in his letters, and Mark suspected those records would contain the specific information he needed. The D symbol on Vincent's map led him to the mansion's old pantry, where a section of apparently solid wall concealed another hiding place. This chamber was smaller than the others, but it contained what Mark was looking for. A collection of meticulously kept business ledgers that chronicled Vincent's financial activities from 1920 through 1987. The earliest ledger, bound in cracked leather and written in Vincent's careful handwriting, detailed the bootlegging operation with accounting precision that would have impressed any CPA. Every transaction was recorded, every expense documented, every partner's share calculated to the penny. But what struck Mark was how quickly Vincent had moved to legitimize his earnings. By 1925, according to the ledger, Vincent was using bootlegging profits to invest in legitimate businesses, a construction company, several rental properties, and what appeared to be a small bank in a neighboring county. The illegal income was being systematically laundered through legal enterprises, but unlike typical money laundering, Vincent seemed to be genuinely building legitimate wealth rather than simply hiding criminal profits. The ledger from 1930 to 1935 told the story of Vincent's transition from criminal to legitimate businessman. But it also revealed something more interesting. Vincent had been systematically gathering financial information about his criminal associates, documenting their operations with the same precision he applied to his own businesses. Torino payment, 50-0. Source: Henderson Bank, money transfer. Purpose: protection racket collections from downtown businesses. Evidence secured. Mayor Hensley payment, 5-0. Source: City Improvement Fund diversion. Purpose: zoning, variance approval. Documentation copied. Vincent hadn't just been keeping books. He had been building a financial case against the entire corruption network. Every payment, every bribe, every illegal transaction had been documented with dates, amounts, sources, and purposes. It was the kind of detailed financial evidence that prosecutors dreamed of finding. The later ledgers, from the 1940s through the 1980s, showed how Vincent had continued this documentation even after his supposed death. Working under assumed identities, he had tracked the evolution of the corruption network as it adapted to changing times and new opportunities. Prohibition had ended, but the criminals Vincent had worked with had simply moved into other enterprises, gambling, labor, racketeering, and eventually what appeared to be large-scale money laundering operations. But it was the final ledger, covering 1,981,987, that made Mark understand why Vincent's enemies were still actively searching for his evidence. The entries detailed a money laundering operation that was processing millions of dollars annually through local businesses, banks, and real estate transactions. And according to Vincent's notes, the operation was still active as of 1987. Henderson Bank continues processing Chicago funds through legitimate business loans. Current annual volume, approximately 15 million. Primary local contact, James Henderson, son of original associate. FBI contact, Agent Martinez. Documentation provided quarterly. Downtown development project, serving as front for land acquisition scheme. Legitimate businesses forced out through harassment. Properties acquired below market value, resold to Chicago associates at significant profit. Current coordinator, City Council member Patricia Hensley, daughter of former mayor. Mark felt a chill as he recognized names from his recent experiences. James Henderson was probably the father of the current Mr. Henderson at the bank, the man who had been so helpful when Mark accessed Vincent's safety deposit box. And if there was a Patricia Hensley on the current city council, it meant the corruption network Vincent had been fighting was still active, still organized, and still involved many of the same families. The ledger's final entries were the most disturbing. Network has discovered informant activities, surveillance increased, recommend accelerating evidence preservation and transfer protocols. Air selection criteria must include capability for self-protection and commitment to completing work regardless of personal risk. Final preparations completed, all evidence secured in primary cache location. Financial assets transferred to irrevocable trust with clear succession criteria. If reading this, the heir has demonstrated necessary intelligence and persistence. Warning, they know someone is close to finding what they have sought for decades. Extreme caution advised. Vincent's final entry was dated just 2 weeks before his death. They have found me. Death may not be natural. All evidence preserved for worthy heir. Complete the work. Justice delayed is not justice denied if someone has the courage to finish what was started. Mark closed the ledger with hands that were trembling. Vincent Blackwood had been murdered not by accident or illness, but by the criminal network he had spent decades fighting. And that same network was still operating, still searching for his evidence, still capable of violence against anyone who threatened their operations. The sound of a car engine in the driveway made Mark look up sharply. Through the pantry window, he could see a familiar black sedan pulling up to the house. 2 men in suits got out, and Mark recognized the confident, purposeful way they moved toward the front door. These weren't casual visitors. Mark quickly returned the ledger to its hiding place and sealed the chamber, his mind racing through options. Emma was still in the back garden, too far away for him to reach without being seen by the approaching men. His phone was in the kitchen, equally inaccessible, and according to Vincent's records, these people had been willing to kill to protect their secrets. The doorbell rang with the kind of polite insistence that suggested the visitors wouldn't be easily discouraged. Mark took a deep breath, checked to make sure Vincent's pocket watch was securely in his pocket, and went to answer the door. The 2 men on his porch looked exactly like what Mark had expected, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the kind of bland faces that would be forgotten 5 minutes after a conversation ended. The larger man smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Robert Chen, and this is my associate, Mr. Patterson." We represent certain business interests in the area, and we understand you've been exploring the history of this property. Just trying to understand what I inherited, Mark said, keeping his voice steady and his body positioned to block their view into the house. Is there something I can help you with? We believe there may be some historical documents or artifacts on this property that belong to our clients, Chen said smoothly. Items that were removed from their rightful owners many years ago. We'd be happy to compensate you for any assistance in locating these materials. I'm not sure what you mean, Mark replied. I've found some old books and papers, but nothing that seemed particularly valuable. Patterson spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a subtle edge that Chen's had lacked. Mr. Thompson, we know you've been to the bank, and we know you've accessed certain storage facilities. We're prepared to be very generous in exchange for your cooperation, but we need to recover what was taken from our families. Mark felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to remain calm. I think there's been some misunderstanding. I inherited this house through a divorce settlement, and I'm just trying to fix it up for my daughter and me. I haven't taken anything from anyone. Chen's smile became slightly less friendly. Perhaps we could come inside and discuss this more privately. We understand you have a young daughter, and we wouldn't want any misunderstandings to affect her well-being. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Mark's protective instincts flared, but he also realized that showing fear would only confirm that he had found something worth threatening him for. I appreciate your concern, Mark said, but my daughter and I are doing just fine. If you believe someone has taken property that belongs to your clients, you should probably speak with the police or a lawyer about recovering it through proper channels. Patterson stepped closer, and Mark could smell cigarettes and aftershave. Mr. Thompson, some problems are better solved privately, between reasonable people. Our clients have been very patient for many years, but their patience isn't unlimited. And neither is my time, Mark replied, beginning to close the door. If you have a legal claim to anything on this property, have your lawyers contact me. Otherwise, I think this conversation is over. Chen's hand shot out to prevent the door from closing. We'll be in touch, Mr. Thompson, soon. After the men left, Mark immediately went to the back garden to collect Emma, his heart pounding with adrenaline and fear. His daughter looked up from the flower bed where she'd been digging, her face bright with innocent excitement. Daddy, I found pretty rocks. Can we keep them? Of course, sweetheart, Mark said, scooping her up in a hug that was as much for his comfort as hers. How would you like to go visit Grandma and Grandpa for a few days? Emma's face lit up with excitement. Really? Can we go now? As Mark packed a bag for Emma and made arrangements to drive her to his parents' house 3 hours away, he realized that Vincent's treasure hunt had reached a turning point. The people Vincent had been fighting were still active, still dangerous, and now they knew that Mark was close to finding what they had been seeking for decades. But sending Emma to safety also meant that Mark was free to take risks he couldn't consider while she was in danger. Vincent Blackwood had spent his life fighting corruption and injustice, ultimately paying the ultimate price for his commitment to doing what was right. Now Mark faced the same choice Vincent had faced: personal safety or public responsibility. The business ledger had shown him that the corruption network was still active, still profitable, and still willing to use violence to protect their operations. But it had also shown him that Vincent had gathered decades of evidence that could finally bring them to justice. As Mark drove Emma to his parents' house, explaining that Daddy had some work to finish at the mansion, he realized that he had already made his choice. Vincent Blackwood had trusted him with more than just money. He had trusted him with the responsibility to complete work that had cost Vincent his life. The pocket watch ticked steadily from Mark's pocket as he drove through the gathering darkness, carrying his daughter to safety while he prepared to follow Vincent Blackwood's path into a tunnel system that held the key to justice that had been delayed for nearly a century. Mark returned to Blackwood Manor near midnight, the house dark and silent without Emma's presence. He had spent the 3-hour drive back from his parents' house, mentally preparing for what he expected to be a dangerous descent into Vincent's tunnel system. The business ledger had made it clear that he was dealing with people who had killed before and would kill again to protect their secrets. But as he pulled into the driveway, Mark noticed something that stopped him cold. The front porch light was on, and warm yellow light glowed in several of the mansion's windows. Someone was inside his house, and they weren't trying to hide their presence. Mark sat in his truck for a long moment, considering his options. He could call the police, but Vincent's records had suggested that local law enforcement might be compromised. He could drive away, but that would mean abandoning everything he'd worked to uncover. Or he could go inside and confront whoever was waiting for him. The decision was made for him when the front door opened and a figure stepped onto the porch. It was a man Mark had never seen before, tall, silver-haired, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in the rural setting. He raised one hand in a gesture that seemed more greeting than threat. "Mr. Thompson," the man called. "My name is Richard Blackwood. I believe we need to talk." Mark climbed out of his truck slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the pocket watch in his jacket. "Blackwood? As in Vincent Blackwood?" "My grandfather," Richard said, stepping into the porch light, "though I suspect you know more about him than I gave you credit for when we first began watching your progress." "You've been watching me?" Mark asked, though he wasn't entirely surprised. "For weeks," Richard admitted. "Since you first accessed the safety deposit box, actually. But not for the reasons you probably think." Richard gestured toward the open front door. "Please come inside. Your house, after all. And we have a great deal to discuss before those other gentlemen return with less polite intentions." Against his better judgment, Mark followed Richard into the mansion. The electricity was working, something that hadn't been true when he'd left that morning, and the rooms were comfortably lit and warmed. Someone had been busy during his absence. "You had the power turned on," Mark observed. "Among other things," Richard said, leading him toward the kitchen where Mark could smell fresh coffee brewing. "I took the liberty of having several utility services restored. Consider it a gesture of good faith." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Mark had spent hours studying Vincent's maps and documents. Richard poured coffee from a pot that definitely hadn't been there that morning, and Mark noticed that the man's hands were steady and confident, despite what had to be an unusual situation. "You said you're Vincent's grandson," Mark began, "but according to everything I've found, Vincent died in 1934. Richard smiled, and for the first time, Mark could see a family resemblance, something in the eyes, and the way he held his head that reminded him of the photographs he'd seen of Vincent. "Vincent Blackwood died in 1934, Richard agreed, "but my grandfather lived until 1987 under the name Richard Blackwood Sr. He chose to take his son's name when he faked his death, and I inherited both the name and certain responsibilities that go with it." Mark felt his understanding of Vincent's story shift again. "You're saying Vincent assumed his son's identity?" "It was a simpler time for such deceptions," Richard said. "My father Vincent's actual son had died in infancy in 1932. Vincent kept the birth certificate, and when he needed a new identity 2 years later, Richard Blackwood became a convenient solution." Richard reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila folder. "These are legal documents that will help clarify the situation. But the short version is that Vincent Blackwood's estate has been managed by his descendants for the past 37 years, waiting for the right person to emerge as heir to his complete legacy." Mark opened the folder to find documents that made the materials in Vincent's safety deposit box look simple by comparison. There were legal papers, trust fund statements, and what appeared to be a will that had been written and rewritten multiple times over several decades. The most recent version was dated 1985, 2 years before Vincent's actual death. In clear legal language, it established that the entire Blackwood estate, including financial assets, real estate holdings, business interests, and what the document carefully termed historical materials, would transfer to whoever could demonstrate three things: legal ownership of Blackwood Manor, knowledge of Vincent's complete story, and the character necessary to continue Vincent's work of justice. "You've been testing me," Mark said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "For months," Richard confirmed. "Ever since you first inherited the house, we've been watching to see what kind of man you are. The divorce settlement that gave you Blackwood Manor wasn't coincidence. My family has significant influence in local legal circles, and we made sure the property went to someone who genuinely needed help, rather than someone who would simply sell it for quick profit." Mark stared at Richard, trying to process what he was hearing. "You manipulated my divorce settlement. We influenced it," Richard corrected. "Your ex-wife was perfectly happy to saddle you with what she believed was a worthless property. We simply made sure that particular property was available for the settlement." "And the threatening visitors today, Chen and Patterson?" Richard's expression darkened. "Those men represent the same criminal network my grandfather spent his life fighting. They're still active, still searching for Vincent's evidence, and they still don't understand that the Blackwood family has been watching them for decades." Richard stood and moved to the kitchen window, looking out into the darkness. "My grandfather didn't just fake his death to escape his criminal associates. He did it to begin a 40-year campaign to destroy them. Every business deal they made, every corrupt politician they bought, every crime they committed was documented and reported to law enforcement." "I found some of that evidence," Mark said. "The photographs, the business ledgers." "You found pieces," Richard said. "The complete evidence cache contains documentation of criminal activities spanning from 1920 to the present day. Names, dates, financial records, photographs, recorded conversations, everything necessary to dismantle an organized crime network that has corrupted this region for nearly a century." Richard returned to the table and sat down, his expression serious. "But here's what my grandfather understood, and what I hope you'll understand. Simply turning that evidence over to authorities isn't enough. The network has survived this long because they have people inside law enforcement, inside banks, inside government offices. They've adapted to investigations before." "Then what's the solution?" Mark asked. Richard pulled out another document, this one looking more recent than the others. "My grandfather's final plan requires someone who isn't part of the existing power structure. Someone who has demonstrated both intelligence and integrity to take control of assets worth nearly $300 million and use those resources to systematically expose and prosecute the entire network." Mark looked at the document Richard had placed before him. It was a detailed plan that would have impressed any military strategist, a coordinated campaign using financial pressure, media exposure, legal challenges, and what appeared to be cooperation with federal law enforcement agencies to simultaneously attack the corruption network on multiple fronts. "Vincent planned all this?" Mark asked. "He planned the framework," Richard said, "but he always knew he wouldn't live to see it implemented. The network discovered his informant activities in 1987 and had him killed, though they made it look like natural causes. Since then, my family has been waiting for the right person to emerge as his heir. And you think that person is me?" Richard leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Mark, in the past month, you've demonstrated exactly the qualities my grandfather was looking for. You've shown intelligence by solving his puzzles, persistence by continuing despite obvious dangers, and integrity by putting your daughter's safety ahead of personal gain. Most importantly, you've shown that you understand the difference between wealth and worth." Mark was quiet for a long moment, studying Vincent's plan and trying to understand the full scope of what was being offered to him. It wasn't just a fortune, it was a responsibility to complete work that had cost Vincent his life and had consumed Richard's family for decades. "What about the men who visited me today?" Mark asked. What happens when they realize I'm not going to cooperate with them? Richard's smile was grim. They won't realize that because, as far as they know, you don't have access to what they're looking for. Tomorrow, you'll receive a call from a law firm in the state capital, informing you that you've inherited a modest trust fund from a distant relative named Richard Blackwood. The amount will be enough to renovate this house and provide security for Emma's future, but not enough to suggest you found Vincent's main cache. And the real inheritance will be managed through separate channels that have been established for decades. You'll have access to resources that will allow you to complete Vincent's work, but the criminal network will believe they're still searching for evidence that remains hidden. Mark looked around the kitchen, his kitchen, in the house that had become home for him and Emma. A month ago, he had been a desperate single father facing financial ruin. Now he was being offered the chance to become the heir to a fortune and a crusade for justice that stretched back nearly a century. "There's one more thing you should know," Richard said quietly. "My grandfather didn't just choose you because of your character. He chose you because you're perfect for this work. Your construction background means you understand how things are built and how they can be torn down. Your experience with financial hardship means you understand what corruption costs ordinary people. And your love for your daughter means you understand what's at stake for future generations." Richard stood to leave, pausing at the kitchen door. "Take your time deciding, Mark, but don't take too long. Vincent Blackwood waited 90 years for justice. The people who killed him are still profiting from the corruption he died fighting. And Emma deserves to inherit a world where crime doesn't pay and justice isn't for sale." After Richard left, Mark sat alone in the restored mansion, holding Vincent's pocket watch and trying to understand how completely his life had changed. The threatening visitors, the surveillance, the mysterious searches, all of it had been orchestrated by Vincent's family to test whether Mark was worthy of inheriting not just money, but a mission that would define the rest of his life. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his hands, counting time toward a decision that would determine whether Vincent Blackwood's final plan would succeed or whether the criminal network he had fought would continue corrupting future generations. Mark Thompson, unemployed construction worker and struggling single father, had become the focal point of a battle between justice and corruption that had been raging for nearly a century. And tomorrow, he would have to decide which side would ultimately win. Mark didn't sleep that night. He spent the hours before dawn walking through the mansion, seeing it with new eyes, now that he understood its true purpose. Vincent Blackwood hadn't just built a home, he had created the headquarters for a decades-long campaign against corruption, a fortress where evidence could be gathered and justice could be planned. The restored electricity allowed Mark to see details he had missed in his earlier explorations. Hidden switches controlled concealed lighting in the secret chambers. The basement held not just storage areas, but what appeared to be a complete communications center, with equipment that looked like it had been updated periodically over the decades. Vincent's descendants had been maintaining this place as a functional base of operations, not just a monument to the past. At sunrise, Mark called his parents to check on Emma. His daughter's excited chatter about her adventure with Grandma and Grandpa reminded him of what was really at stake. Richard had been right. This wasn't just about money or even justice in the abstract. It was about the kind of world Emma would inherit, and whether that world would be shaped by corruption or by people willing to fight for what was right. After breakfast, Mark found himself drawn back to Vincent's original hiding place in the basement. The pocket watch seemed heavier in his hands, now that he understood its significance, not just as a guide to hidden treasure, but as a symbol of responsibility passed down through generations. The tiny map in the watch's secret compartment showed more detail in the morning light. Mark could see that several of the symbols he hadn't yet investigated were located in areas of the house he had barely explored. If Vincent had hidden a master key somewhere in the mansion, it would likely be in one of these unmarked locations. The search took most of the morning, but Mark found it in the last place. He looked behind a loose stone in the mansion's original coal cellar. in a space so perfectly concealed that he might never have found it without the map's guidance. The master key was unlike any of the others Vincent had hidden. This was clearly a ceremonial piece, heavy and ornate, with intricate engravings that matched the style of the pocket watch. But it was the note attached to the key that made Mark understand the full scope of what Vincent had planned. Written in the old man's careful handwriting, it was addressed simply to the heir. "If you hold this key, you have proven yourself worthy of the trust I place in you. But worthiness and willingness are different things. Before you open the final chamber, before you claim the inheritance I have preserved, I ask you to consider carefully what you are accepting. The fortune is real, and it is yours by right of character and demonstration. But with that fortune comes the obligation to complete work that has cost lives, including my own. The men who killed me are still alive, still active, still profiting from corruption that impoverishes communities and destroys families. They will kill you too if you threaten their operations, and they will not hesitate to harm your daughter if they believe it will stop you. But if you choose to accept this responsibility, you will have resources that I never possessed. My descendants have spent decades preparing for this moment, gathering allies, building relationships with honest law enforcement officers, and creating the infrastructure necessary to finally destroy the network I helped create in my youth. The final chamber contains not just evidence, but a complete plan for justice. Every corrupt politician, every criminal operation, every illegal transaction is documented with the kind of detail that will ensure convictions. But implementing that plan will require courage that I hope you possess, and wisdom that I pray you will develop. Choose carefully. Once you open that door, you cannot return to the life you knew. But if you choose not to open it, you will always know that you had the chance to make a difference and chose safety instead. Mark held the master key for a long time, thinking about the choice Vincent was asking him to make. A month ago, his biggest worry had been paying the electricity bill and finding steady work. Now he was being asked to take on a criminal network that had been operating for nearly a century, using resources worth hundreds of millions of dollars to complete a mission that had already cost Vincent his life. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted his thoughts. Through the basement window, Mark could see Richard Blackwood approaching the house, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman in her 40s walked beside him, and Mark could see the family resemblance immediately. She had Vincent's eyes and the same air of quiet determination that Mark had noticed in Richard. Mark met them at the front door, the master key still warm in his palm. "Mark, this is my sister Catherine," Richard said. "She's been coordinating the legal aspects of Grandfather's plan." Catherine Blackwood was a striking woman, professionally dressed, but with calloused hands that suggested she was more than just a lawyer. When she shook Mark's hand, her grip was firm and confident. "I understand you've reached the final decision point," she said without preamble. "Richard tells me you've found the master key." Mark nodded, pulling the ornate key from his pocket. "I've also read Vincent's final message. He wasn't exaggerating about the risks, was he?" "Not at all," Catherine said seriously. "The network that killed our grandfather is still active, still dangerous, and still has resources that most people can't imagine. If you decide to complete his work, you'll be declaring war on people who have been winning that war for 90 years. But you'll also have advantages they don't expect," Richard added. "Legal authority, financial resources, and most importantly, allies who have been preparing for this moment for decades." Catherine opened a briefcase she'd been carrying and spread documents across the kitchen table. "These are the operational plans Grandfather developed, updated with current information about the network's activities. We're talking about systematic exposure of corruption in banking, real estate, local government, and law enforcement. The evidence exists to prosecute dozens of people and dismantle criminal operations worth tens of millions of dollars annually." Mark studied the documents, seeing organizational charts that looked like something from a military campaign. Names, dates, locations, financial records, everything necessary to coordinate simultaneous investigations that would prevent the network from covering up evidence or eliminating witnesses. "How long have you been planning this?" Mark asked. "Since 1987, Richard said. "The night grandfather died, he made us promise to find the right person to complete his work. We've been searching for 37 years. And you think I'm that person?" Catherine leaned forward, her expression intense. "Mark, in the past month, you've solved puzzles that have stumped professional investigators. You've shown integrity under pressure, courage when threatened, and wisdom in protecting your daughter. Most importantly, you understand what corruption costs ordinary families because you've lived that cost." "But I'm not a lawyer or an investigator," Mark protested. "I'm a construction worker who got lucky in a treasure hunt." "You're exactly what grandfather was looking for," Richard said. "Someone outside the existing power structure. Someone who can't be bought or intimidated because you have nothing to lose and everything to gain. The network has survived this long because they've been fighting people who played by rules that they ignore. You don't have to play by those rules." Catherine pulled out a thick folder marked Implementation Timeline. "If you accept, we begin immediately. Federal authorities have been briefed and are ready to coordinate with us. Media contacts are prepared to publish evidence simultaneously across multiple outlets. Financial institutions have been alerted to freeze accounts on our signal. We've even arranged for protective custody for you and Emma during the most dangerous phases." Mark looked at the timeline, seeing a carefully choreographed sequence of events that would unfold over several months. Grand jury indictments, asset seizures, media exposures, and public trials, all designed to ensure that the network couldn't cover up evidence or eliminate threats. "What happens if I say no?" Mark asked. Richard and Catherine exchanged a look that spoke of long-held hope and feared disappointment. "The modest trust fund becomes real," Catherine said quietly. "You'll have enough money to renovate this house, provide for Emma's education, and live comfortably for the rest of your life. No one will ever bother you again, and you can forget you ever heard the name Vincent Blackwood." "And the corruption continues," Mark said. "The corruption continues," Richard confirmed. "Another generation grows up in a community where crime pays and justice is for sale. Emma grows up in a world where the same families who killed our grandfather continue profiting from other people's misery." Mark stood and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where Emma had played just days before. Vincent Blackwood had faced this same choice in 1920, personal safety or public responsibility. He had chosen responsibility and paid the ultimate price. But his sacrifice had preserved the possibility that someday, someone would have the chance to finish what he started. "There's one thing I need to know," Mark said, turning back to Richard and Catherine. "If I do this, if I accept Vincent's inheritance and implement his plan, what guarantee do I have that Emma will be safe?" Catherine opened another folder, this one containing what appeared to be detailed security arrangements. "We've been planning for your daughter's protection since the day you inherited this house. Safe houses, private security, even new identities if necessary. Emma's safety isn't just our priority, it's our guarantee to you." Mark picked up the master key, feeling its weight in his palm. Vincent Blackwood had spent 67 years fighting corruption, first as a participant and then as an opponent. He had faked his death, lived in hiding, gathered evidence, and ultimately died for the cause of justice. Now he was asking Mark to complete the work he had started. "Where is the final chamber?" Mark asked. Richard smiled for the first time since entering the house. "Grandfather built it in the most obvious place possible, right beneath our feet. The mansion's foundation includes a vault that connects to the tunnel system. Everything we need to destroy the network that killed him has been waiting here for 37 years. As afternoon turned to evening, Mark found himself standing in the basement with Vincent's master key in his hand, facing a door he had never noticed before. Hidden behind what appeared to be a structural support beam, the entrance to Vincent's final chamber had been waiting patiently for the right person to discover it. Mark inserted the master key into the elaborate lock, hearing the smooth click of mechanisms that had been maintained and tested for decades. As the heavy door swung open, revealing a chamber filled with documents, recordings, and evidence that would finally bring justice to a corruption network that had operated with impunity for nearly a century, Mark realized that his life as Mark Thompson, struggling single father, was ending. Tomorrow, he would begin his new life as Vincent Blackwood's heir, with the resources and responsibility to complete a mission that had been 90 years in the making. The pocket watch ticked steadily in his jacket, keeping time as Mark Thompson prepared to become the instrument of justice that Vincent Blackwood had died, believing would someday emerge from the shadows to set things right. The door to Vincent's final chamber opened into a space that took Mark's breath away. This wasn't just a hiding place, it was a command center that had been designed to coordinate a campaign for justice spanning decades. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, computer equipment, and communication devices that looked like they belonged in a federal law enforcement office rather than the basement of a Victorian mansion. But it was the massive table in the center of the room that captured Mark's attention. Spread across its surface was what appeared to be a three-dimensional map of the entire corruption network, with colored strings connecting photographs, documents, and location markers in a web that showed relationships spanning nearly a century. Richard and Catherine followed Mark into the chamber, their expressions reverent as they entered what was clearly a sacred space for their family. "Grandfather called this the Justice Room," Catherine said quietly. "He spent the last years of his life working here, documenting every connection, every crime, every piece of evidence necessary to destroy the network he had helped create." Mark moved closer to the table, studying the intricate web of connections. Names he recognized from Vincent's journals were linked to current city officials, local business leaders, and what appeared to be several prominent families in the region. The scope of the corruption was staggering. It touched every aspect of community life, from banking and real estate to law enforcement and local government. "How did Vincent gather all this evidence?" Mark asked, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of documentation. 60 years of patient investigation," Richard said. "After he faked his death, Grandfather became the ultimate inside observer. He had access to criminal operations because they thought he was dead, and he had credibility with law enforcement because he was providing information that led to successful prosecutions. He was perfectly positioned to document both sides of the corruption." Catherine opened one of the filing cabinets, revealing rows of meticulously organized folders. Every major crime committed by the network since 1934 is documented here. Financial records, photographs, recorded conversations, witness statements, everything necessary to secure convictions in a court of law. Mark picked up a folder labeled Current Operations, Henderson Banking Network, and found inside it documents that made his recent experience at the bank take on new significance. Mr. Henderson hadn't just been helping Mark access Vincent's safety deposit box. He had been reporting that access to people who had been searching for Vincent's evidence for decades. "They know I found the evidence," Mark said, holding up a surveillance photograph that showed him leaving the bank with Richard's documents. "They know you accessed the safety deposit box," Catherine corrected, "but they don't know you found this chamber or understood the full scope of what Vincent preserved. As far as they know, you're still just a lucky treasure hunter who might have stumbled across a few old documents." Richard moved to a computer terminal that looked surprisingly modern for equipment hidden in a mansion basement. Grandfather's plan was always to use their ignorance against them. The network has survived by staying ahead of investigations, by knowing what law enforcement was planning and adapting accordingly. But they can't adapt to evidence they don't know exists. The computer screen displayed what appeared to be a real-time monitoring system, showing bank transactions, property transfers, and communication intercepts that suggested Vincent's intelligence-gathering operation had continued even after his death. "How is this possible?" Mark asked, staring at current data streams that showed ongoing criminal activity. "Grandfather recruited allies over the decades," Catherine explained. "Honest law enforcement officers, ethical lawyers, reform-minded politicians, people who shared his commitment to justice but couldn't act without the kind of comprehensive evidence he was gathering. They've been feeding information to this system for 30 years, waiting for the moment when someone would have the authority and resources to act on it." Mark found himself looking at a document that made everything click into place, a detailed legal framework for what Vincent called the community trust. It wasn't just a plan for exposing corruption. It was a blueprint for rebuilding the community's institutions with transparency and accountability. Vincent wasn't just planning to destroy the criminal network, Mark realized. He was planning to replace it with something better. "Exactly," Richard said with pride in his voice. "Grandfather understood that simply arresting corrupt officials wasn't enough. He needed to create systems that would prevent corruption from taking root again. The community trust would use his financial assets to support honest businesses, ethical politicians, and community programs that would strengthen the social fabric that corruption had been tearing apart." Catherine pulled out another set of documents, these bearing official government seals and legal signatures. "We've been working with federal authorities for months, preparing for this moment. The FBI, the IRS, and the Justice Department are ready to coordinate simultaneous investigations based on Vincent's evidence. But they needed someone with legal standing to request the investigations and the financial resources to see them through to completion. And that someone is me," Mark said, understanding finally dawning. "That someone is you," Catherine confirmed. "As Vincent's legal heir, you have the authority to authorize the release of his evidence and the responsibility to manage the trust fund that will ensure justice is served." Mark spent the next hour reviewing the trust documents, understanding the scope of the responsibility he was being asked to accept. The Vincent Blackwood Community Trust wasn't just a financial inheritance. It was a commitment to use nearly $300 million to systematically rebuild every institution that corruption had compromised. The plan was comprehensive and ambitious. Honest businesses would receive low-interest loans to compete with companies controlled by the criminal network. Reform candidates for local office would receive campaign funding and support. Community programs would be established to provide alternatives to the illegal activities that had flourished under corrupt leadership. Most importantly, oversight mechanisms would be created to ensure that future corruption could be detected and stopped before it could take root. "This is bigger than just exposing crime," Mark said, looking up from the documents. Vincent was planning to transform the entire community. "He was planning to give people a choice," Richard said. "For 90 years, the criminal network has succeeded because they were the only game in town. They controlled the banks, the politicians, the business opportunities. Vincent's plan creates alternatives, legitimate ways for honest people to succeed without having to cooperate with corruption." Catherine moved to a wall safe that Mark hadn't noticed, entering a combination that caused the heavy door to swing open. Inside were stacks of bearer bonds, cash, and what appeared to be account information for offshore financial institutions. "The liquid assets," she explained, "everything necessary to begin implementation immediately. Once you sign the trust documents, you'll have access to resources that will allow you to fund the entire operation without relying on traditional banking systems that the network might control." Mark looked around the justice room, seeing it now as Vincent had intended, not just a place to gather evidence, but a command center for rebuilding a community that had been corrupted for nearly a century. The old man hadn't just been fighting crime, he had been planning renaissance. "There's one more thing you need to see," Richard said, leading Mark to a section of the chamber he hadn't yet explored. Behind a curtain was what appeared to be a complete television production studio with cameras, editing equipment, and broadcasting capabilities. Grandfather understood that evidence was worthless if people didn't know about it, Catherine explained. The network has survived by controlling information, by ensuring that their crimes never received public attention. This equipment will allow us to bypass traditional media channels and communicate directly with the community. Mark realized he was looking at the infrastructure for a revolution, not a violent overthrow, but a systematic replacement of corruption with transparency, of criminal enterprise with community building, of fear with hope. The trust documents lay open on the table before him, waiting for his signature. Vincent Blackwood had spent 90 years building the resources and gathering the evidence necessary to transform a community. Now he was asking Mark Thompson, a struggling single father who had inherited a rundown mansion, to complete the most ambitious campaign for justice in American history. Mark picked up the pen Catherine had placed beside the documents, feeling the weight of Vincent's pocket watch in his jacket. Somewhere above them, Emma was probably playing with her grandparents, unaware that her father was about to sign documents that would change not just their lives, but the lives of everyone in their community. "Once I sign this, there's no going back," Mark said. "Once you sign this, you become Vincent Blackwood's true heir," Richard replied, "and justice that has been delayed for 90 years finally gets the chance to be served." Mark signed the trust documents with a hand that was steadier than he expected. As his pen completed the final signature, he felt something shift, not just legally, but spiritually. He was no longer Mark Thompson, struggling single father. He was Vincent Blackwood's heir, with all the resources and responsibilities that came with that inheritance. Catherine immediately began making phone calls, activating plans that had been decades in preparation. Within minutes, Mark could hear the distant sound of vehicles arriving at the mansion as federal agents, prosecutors, and media representatives converged on what would become the coordination center for the largest anti-corruption operation in the region's history. But before the chaos of implementation began, Richard approached Mark with one final envelope. "Grandfather left this for whoever accepted his inheritance," Richard said quietly. He wrote it the night before he died, knowing it would probably be his last chance to explain what he truly hoped to accomplish. Mark opened the envelope to find a handwritten letter that was different from all the other documents he had found. This wasn't written in Vincent's careful, business-like script. This was personal, emotional, the words of a dying man trying to communicate across time to someone he would never meet. "My dear heir, if you are reading this, you have chosen to accept a burden that I would not wish on anyone, but which someone must carry if justice is to mean anything in this world. You have seen the evidence of corruption, understood the scope of criminality, and accepted responsibility for completing work that has cost me everything I valued in life. I want you to understand why I made the choices that led to this moment. In 1920, I was a young man who thought he was clever enough to profit from other people's vices without being corrupted by them. I believed I could work with criminals without becoming one, could take their money without adopting their values. I was wrong about everything except one thing. I was clever enough to recognize my mistakes and spend the rest of my life trying to correct them. The fortune you inherit was built on crime, but it was cleansed through decades of legitimate investment and charitable work. Every dollar you will spend fighting corruption was earned honestly through businesses that provided real value to real people. I wanted to be certain that justice would not be funded by injustice. But money, no matter how it was earned, is not what makes you my heir. What makes you my heir is your willingness to choose difficult responsibility over easy comfort, to risk everything you have for people you will never meet, to believe that ordinary individuals can defeat systems that seem too powerful to challenge. I have been watching you for months, through my descendants who have become my eyes and ears in the world. I have seen how you care for your daughter, how you treat people who cannot help you, how you respond to pressure and temptation. You are the kind of man I hoped to become, but failed to be when it mattered most. You are the kind of father I wish I had been to my son, the kind of citizen I wish I had been to my community. The work you are beginning will be dangerous, difficult, and thankless. The people you help will often not know they have been helped. The criminals you defeat will be replaced by others who are equally corrupt. Success will be measured not in absolute victory, but in incremental progress toward a community where honesty is rewarded and crime is punished. But if you succeed, when you succeed, children like your daughter will grow up in a place where opportunity is based on merit rather than connections, where justice is blind to wealth and status, where community leaders serve the public rather than themselves. That is the inheritance I really want to leave behind. I have one final request. In the safe behind you, there is a photograph of my family, my wife, my son, and myself, taken in 1925, before I understood what my choices would cost them. They died not knowing that I spent every day of my life, after 1934, trying to make amends for the harm I had caused. Please keep that photograph with you as you do this work. Remember that behind every crime there are victims, and behind every act of corruption there are families whose lives are diminished. Remember also that behind every act of courage, there are people whose lives are improved, whose children have better futures, whose communities are strengthened. You are not just fighting against something, you are building towards something better. I wish I could be there to help you with the work ahead. I wish I could meet your daughter and tell her that her father is a hero in ways she will not understand for many years. I wish I could shake your hand and thank you for being willing to complete what I started. Since I cannot do any of those things, I will settle for this. Thank you for having the courage to choose justice over safety, for being willing to risk what you have to protect what matters, for proving that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they decide that doing right is more important than doing well. You are Vincent Blackwood's heir not because you inherited his wealth, but because you inherited his commitment to making the world better than you found it. Use the resources wisely, trust the allies we have cultivated, and never forget that the true measure of success is not what you accumulate for yourself, but what you create for others. With profound respect and gratitude, Vincent Blackwood, written October 15th, 1987, the last night of an old man's life, the first day of his heir's mission. Mark read the letter twice, feeling the weight of Vincent's words settle around him like a mantle. He found the photograph Vincent had mentioned, a family portrait that showed a younger Vincent with a beautiful woman and a small boy, all of them smiling with the unconscious happiness of people who believed their future was secure. He lost them because of his choices, Richard said quietly, having read the letter many times over the years. His wife died in 1933, probably from the stress of living with a man involved in dangerous activities. His son died of pneumonia the year after, and grandfather always believed that if he hadn't been distracted by criminal affairs, he might have gotten the boy better medical care sooner. Mark understood now why Vincent had been so specific about character requirements for his heir. The old man hadn't just been looking for someone capable of completing his mission. He had been looking for someone who understood that family was more important than any cause, even a just one. That's why Emma's safety was built into the plan from the beginning, Catherine said, watching Mark study the photograph. Grandfather never wanted his heir to face the choice he had faced, family or justice. He spent 40 years ensuring that whoever completed his work would be able to protect the people they loved. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mark's phone rang with a call from his parents. Emma's excited voice filled the justice room as she told her father about her day with Grandma and Grandpa, completely unaware that her world was about to change in ways that would ultimately make it safer and more secure. "I love you too, sweetheart," Mark said as the call ended. "I'll see you very soon. Outside, Mark could hear the sound of vehicles and voices as federal agents began the complex process of implementing Vincent's plan. Search warrants were being executed, bank accounts were being frozen, and arrests were being made based on evidence that had been waiting decades for someone with the authority to act on it. But in the justice room, Mark stood quietly with Vincent's letter in his hands, understanding that he had inherited more than money or even responsibility. He had inherited the chance to prove that justice was possible, that corruption could be defeated, that ordinary people could stand up to systems that seemed too powerful to challenge. Vincent Blackwood had spent 90 years building toward this moment, first as a criminal who recognized his mistakes, then as an informant who gathered evidence, finally as a visionary who planned a future where crime would not pay and justice would not be for sale. Now it was Mark Thompson's turn to prove that Vincent's faith had been justified, that his sacrifice had been worthwhile, that his vision of a better community could become reality. The pocket watch continued its steady rhythm in Mark's jacket, counting time as justice that had been delayed for nearly a century finally began to unfold. 6 months later, Mark stood in the renovated kitchen of Blackwood Manor, watching Emma help Mrs. Chen prepare cookies for the community centre's grand opening. The mansion had been transformed from a decaying monument to the past into a vibrant hub of community activity, exactly as Vincent had envisioned. The kitchen, where Mark had first studied Vincent's mysterious maps, now served meals to families participating in the after-school program. The parlor, where he had discovered hidden chambers, now hosted town meetings where citizens could directly address their elected officials. The justice room in the basement had become the headquarters for what the media had dubbed the Blackwood Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting community development and government transparency. "Mr. Mark, the cookies are ready," Emma announced, her face bright with flour and happiness. At 6 years old, she had adapted to their new life with the resilience that children possessed, accepting their transformed circumstances as naturally as she had once accepted their struggles. "They smell wonderful, sweetheart," Mark said, lifting her up to see the cooling racks. "Are you excited about the party tonight?" "Mrs. Chen says there will be music and dancing," Emma said with the kind of anticipation that made ordinary moments magical. "And she says all our friends from town will be here." All their friends from town. Mark marveled at how naturally Emma had claimed this community as home. The mansion that had once seemed like another burden had become the center of a life neither of them could have imagined 6 months ago. The transformation hadn't been easy. The federal investigations, triggered by Vincent's evidence, had resulted in 43 indictments, including several current city officials, 3 bank officers, and the entire Henderson family. The criminal network that had operated with impunity for nearly a century had been systematically dismantled, their assets seized, and their operations shut down. But Vincent's plan had been about more than punishment. It had been about renewal. The Blackwood Foundation had used Vincent's fortune to fund new businesses, support honest candidates for local office, and create programs that gave young people alternatives to the criminal activities that had once been their only path to economic success. Mark himself had discovered talents he never knew he possessed. His construction background made him uniquely qualified to understand community development projects, while his experience with financial hardship helped him relate to families struggling to build better lives. Most importantly, his role as Emma's father kept him grounded in what really mattered, creating a community where children could grow up safely and honestly. The front door opened, and Richard and Catherine Blackwood entered carrying boxes of decorations for the evening's celebration. Over the past 6 months, they had become more than allies in Vincent's mission. They had become family. The aunt and uncle that Emma had never had, the siblings that Mark had always wanted. "How's our guest of honor?" Catherine asked, sweeping Emma into a hug that made the little girl giggle with delight. "I helped make cookies," Emma announced proudly, "and Mrs. Chen taught me to fold napkins like flowers." Mrs. Chen beamed from her position at the kitchen counter. Over the months, the elderly neighbor had revealed herself to be one of Vincent's longtime allies, someone who had quietly supported his work for decades while maintaining the perfect cover of being just another community resident. She had become Emma's honorary grandmother and Mark's trusted advisor on navigating the complex social dynamics of small-town life. The final audit results came back from the state capitol, Richard said quietly to Mark, as Emma showed Catherine her napkin-folding skills. Clean accounting on every foundation expenditure, zero evidence of financial irregularities, and a rating that qualifies us for federal matching funds on community development projects. Mark felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with integrity. Vincent's insistence that his fortune be earned honestly and spent transparently had created an organization that could serve as a model for community development nationwide. "Any word from the prosecutors about the appeals?" Mark asked. "2 more guilty pleas this week," Catherine replied with satisfaction. "The Henderson banking case is solid, and James Henderson has agreed to cooperate with ongoing investigations in exchange for a reduced sentence. The network's financial operations are completely shut down." 6 months later, Mark stood in the renovated kitchen of Blackwood Manor, watching Emma help Mrs. Chen prepare cookies for the community center's grand opening. The mansion had been transformed from a decaying monument to the past into a vibrant hub of community activity, exactly as Vincent had envisioned. The kitchen, where Mark had first studied Vincent's mysterious maps, now served meals to families participating in the after-school program. The parlor, where he had discovered hidden chambers, now hosted town meetings where citizens could directly address their elected officials. The justice room in the basement had become the headquarters for what the media had dubbed the Blackwood Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting community development and government transparency. "Mr. Mark, the cookies are ready," Emma announced, her face bright with flour and happiness. At 6 years old, she had adapted to their new life with the resilience that children possessed, accepting their transformed circumstances as naturally as she had once accepted their struggles. "They smell wonderful, sweetheart," Mark said, lifting her up to see the cooling racks. "Are you excited about the party tonight?" "Mrs. Chen says there will be music and dancing," Emma said with the kind of anticipation that made ordinary moments magical. "And she says all our friends from town will be here." All their friends from town. Mark marveled at how naturally Emma had claimed this community as home. The mansion that had once seemed like another burden had become the center of a life neither of them could have imagined 6 months ago. The transformation hadn't been easy. The federal investigations, triggered by Vincent's evidence, had resulted in 43 indictments, including several current city officials, 3 bank officers, and the entire Henderson family. The criminal network that had operated with impunity for nearly a century had been systematically dismantled, their assets seized and their operations shut down. But Vincent's plan had been about more than punishment, it had been about renewal. The Blackwood Foundation had used Vincent's fortune to fund new businesses, support honest candidates for local office, and create programs that gave young people alternatives to the criminal activities that had once been their only path to economic success. Mark himself had discovered talents he never knew he possessed. His construction background made him uniquely qualified to understand community development projects, while his experience with financial hardship helped him relate to families struggling to build better lives. Most importantly, his role as Emma's father kept him grounded in what really mattered, creating a community where children could grow up safely and honestly. The front door opened, and Richard and Catherine Blackwood entered carrying boxes of decorations for the evening's celebration. Over the past 6 months, they had become more than allies in Vincent's mission. They had become family. The aunt and uncle that Emma had never had, the siblings that Mark had always wanted. "How's our guest of honor?" Catherine asked, sweeping Emma into a hug that made the little girl giggle with delight. "I helped make cookies," Emma announced proudly, "and Mrs. Chen taught me to fold napkins like flowers." Mrs. Chen beamed from her position at the kitchen counter. Over the months, the elderly neighbor had revealed herself to be one of Vincent's longtime allies, someone who had quietly supported his work for decades while maintaining the perfect cover of being just another community resident. She had become Emma's honorary grandmother and Mark's trusted advisor on navigating the complex social dynamics of small-town life. The final audit results came back from the state capitol, Richard said quietly to Mark, as Emma showed Catherine her napkin-folding skills. Clean accounting on every foundation expenditure, zero evidence of financial irregularities, and a rating that qualifies us for federal matching funds on community development projects. Mark felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with integrity. Vincent's insistence that his fortune be earned honestly and spent transparently had created an organization that could serve as a model for community development nationwide. "Any word from the prosecutors about the appeals?" Mark asked. "2 more guilty pleas this week," Catherine replied with satisfaction. "The Henderson banking case is solid, and James Henderson has agreed to cooperate with ongoing investigations in exchange for a reduced sentence. The network's financial operations are completely shut down." But Mark knew the real measure of their success wasn't in courtrooms or newspaper headlines. It was in the faces of families who no longer had to choose between honest poverty and dishonest prosperity. It was in young people who saw legitimate opportunities for advancement. It was in local businesses that could operate without paying protection money or competing against enterprises backed by criminal funding. That evening, as the community center filled with neighbors who had become friends, Mark found himself standing in the same spot where he had first discovered Vincent's hidden chamber. The basement had been converted into meeting rooms and office space, but Mark had preserved one corner as a memorial to Vincent Blackwood, a simple display featuring the pocket watch, the original journals, and a photograph of the man whose vision had made all of this possible. Emma appeared at his side, having escaped from the dancing upstairs to find her father. She slipped her small hand into his and studied the memorial with the serious attention she brought to things she sensed were important. "Is that the man who used to live in our house?" she asked. "Yes, sweetheart. His name was Vincent, and he spent his whole life trying to make things better for people." "Like you do now?" Emma asked with the directness that children use to cut through adult complications. Mark smiled, realizing that his 6-year-old daughter had understood something essential about their new life. "I try to do what Vincent would have wanted," he said, "to help people and take care of our community." "And take care of me," Emma added, with the confidence of a child who had never doubted her father's priorities. "And take care of you," Mark agreed, lifting her into his arms. "Always." Through the windows of the community center, Mark could see the lights of a town that was learning to trust again. The new mayor, elected with Blackwood Foundation support, was implementing transparency measures that would have been impossible under the old system. Local businesses were thriving without the burden of corruption taxes. Young families were moving to the area, drawn by opportunities that were based on merit rather than connections. Sarah had visited the week before, ostensibly to check on Emma, but really to understand how dramatically Mark's life had changed. The conversation had been awkward at first, but Mark's obvious happiness and Emma's excitement about their new life had gradually softened Sarah's skepticism. By the end of her visit, she had admitted that she was proud of what Mark had accomplished and grateful that Emma was growing up in a place where integrity was valued over wealth. "She's different here," Sarah had said, watching Emma play in the mansion's restored garden. "More confident, more secure. You've given her something I never could have provided." Mark had understood what Sarah meant. Emma's confidence came not from material abundance, but from living in a community where her father was respected for doing the right thing, where she could see firsthand that individual choices mattered, where she was learning that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences. As the evening celebration continued around them, Mark carried Emma upstairs to the room that had become truly hers, decorated with her own choices. filled with books and toys that had been gifts from their new community family, overlooking a garden where she had planted flowers and vegetables with Mrs. Chen's patient guidance. "Daddy," Emma said as he tucked her into bed, "are we rich now?" It was a question she had asked several times in recent months, trying to understand why their lives had changed so dramatically. Mark had learned to answer it carefully, helping her understand the difference between having money and being wealthy. "We have enough money to take care of ourselves and help other people," he said. "But what makes us really rich is having good friends, living in a safe place, and knowing that we're doing work that matters." "So," Emma nodded solemnly, as if filing this distinction away for future reference. "Vincent was rich too, wasn't he? Even when he didn't have money." Mark smiled at his daughter's wisdom. "Yes, sweetheart, Vincent was rich in all the ways that really matter." After Emma fell asleep, Mark returned to the community center, where the celebration was winding down, but the conversations were intensifying. These monthly gatherings had become more than social events. They were forums where community members could discuss problems, propose solutions, and hold their leaders accountable in ways that hadn't been possible for generations. Mark found himself talking with Tom Rodriguez, a young father who had started a construction business with a Blackwood Foundation loan after the criminal network's building contractors had been shut down. "My grandfather worked for the old system for 40 years, Tom said. "Paid protection money, hired people based on who they knew rather than what they could do, kept quiet about corners being cut on safety inspections. I want my kids to grow up in a place where you succeed by doing good work, not by knowing the right people." These were the conversations that reminded Mark why Vincent's mission had been worth the risks, worth the danger, worth the complete transformation of his life. Tom's children would grow up in a community where merit mattered, where corruption was exposed rather than tolerated, where justice was a reality rather than an aspiration. As the last guests departed, and Mark helped clean up from the celebration, he found himself alone in the mansion for the first time in months. The silence felt different now, not lonely or ominous, but peaceful and full of possibility. This house that had once been a burden had become the foundation for everything good in his life. Mark made his way to Vincent's memorial in the basement, where the pocket watch sat in its place of honor, still keeping perfect time after nearly a century. He pulled Vincent's final letter from the frame where it was displayed, reading again the words that had guided him through the most challenging and rewarding months of his life. "Thank you," Mark said quietly to the photograph of Vincent and his family, "for trusting me with this, for believing that someone like me could complete what you started, for giving Emma and me a chance to be part of something bigger than ourselves." The pocket watch ticked steadily in response, marking time in a house where justice had finally come home. Mark understood now that Vincent's treasure had never been the money, impressive as that fortune was. The real treasure was the opportunity to prove that corruption could be defeated, that communities could be rebuilt, that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they decided that doing right was more important than doing well. As Mark climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, where he now slept peacefully every night, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he had been a desperate single father facing financial ruin, inheriting what seemed like another burden. Tonight, he was the director of a foundation that was transforming an entire community, the father of a confident and happy little girl, and the heir to a legacy that would impact generations. Emma's soft breathing drifted from her room as Mark passed her door, the sound of a child who slept securely because she lived in a world where her father's work made things better rather than worse. That security, Mark realized, was Vincent Blackwood's greatest gift, not just to Emma, but to all the children who would grow up in a community where justice was possible and integrity was rewarded. The pocket watch ticked on through the night, keeping time in a house where the past had finally been redeemed. The present was full of purpose, and the future promised hope for everyone, willing to choose courage over comfort, community over selfishness, and justice over convenience. Mark Thompson had inherited more than a fortune from Vincent Blackwood. He had inherited the chance to prove that one person's choices could change everything, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were the ones that allowed you to enrich other people's lives rather than just your own.